Hello everybody, it's me George, and today I wanted to do a video talking about what day it is, Martinmas. Today is the 11th of November, which is known as Martinmas, or the Feast of Saint Martin de Tours. It is also in the UK known as Remembrance Day as well. This is a day in which we will remember the fallen people that fought for our freedoms, particularly first and second. But for me personally, I tend to kind of pay a lot more attention in regards to the Second World War, because it is something that's quite close to my heart. But today on Martinmas, I guess I wanted to do a little bit of an explanation as to what that is, and bear in mind a brief explanation. I am no way going to be pulling out different references and stuff like that. I'm just going to be talking about common knowledge regarding the Feast of Martinmas. So first of all, we need to look at St. Martin de Tours. We need to look at this saint first of all, and it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because St. Martin de Tours was originally, he was a Roman soldier, but he was pagan, and he had converted from paganism to Christianity. And he essentially, as a Roman soldier, one day was riding upon his horse and saw a beggar on the ground, in which St. Martin took pity of him and with his sword cut his cloak in half and gave the other half of the cloak to the beggar. And there are different variations to this story, but essentially Jesus came to him a couple of days later in a dream, or it's also said that the beggar was actually Jesus in disguise, that actually thanked him for his charity. And that's one of the stories that are kind of heavily associated with St. Martin. Now, it's also interesting here because we have the idea that St. Martin de Tours was a pagan who converted to Christianity. And this is really interesting when it comes to the concept of St. Martinmas. We can kind of draw some comparisons here and also draw similarities. Now, particularly within Old Ireland, it was customary for a person to slaughter an animal, and the blood of that animal would then be sprinkled or aspersed upon the steps of the person's threshold, so that if any blood was to be spilt for the year, it would be that blood that would be being spilt there and then. Okay, so this in itself was kind of a way to make sure everyone in the household was safe, to essentially employ magical insurance for the year of protection, so that everyone would be okay within that threshold, so that the only blood being spilt was the animal. Typically, the animal of choice would be a goose, hence the term and saying every goose has its Martinmas, meaning everyone essentially has their comeuppance. And goose would be an animal that would be traditionally cooked on Martinmas Day. And it's interesting when we look at this, because my friend JD, Cunning as Folk, has, if you seriously have a look at it, Cunning as Folk, he has done a fantastic video regarding, first of all, the lunar eclipse, which was this week, but also not only that, Martinmas. And he talks about the feast and the festival of St. Martinmas. And it's interesting because he talks about it possibly having origins in regards to feeding or giving offerings to the genus loci, to the spirits of place, to the spirits of land, but under the guise of Saint Martin. And if we look at older concepts of folklore, particularly folk Christianity, this in essence, those older pagan elements, but under the guise and mask of Christianity, does kind of build quite a strong foundation to what we have as folk Catholicism or folk Christianity. And it's interesting that he kind of mentioned that within the video. Seriously, I couldn't recommend the video enough. It's a fantastic video that is done, so please have a look at that. Cunning as Folk, Martinmas, and he also talks about the lunar eclipse, but seriously, go and check him out. He's one of my friends, and he really knows his stuff when it comes to astrology in general. He's so switched on. But yeah, it's a fantastic video. But it's interesting that JD had actually mentioned that, because if we look at older pagan sects, for instance, if we look at the influence of the Norse, we have this aspect and idea of elfblot, the idea of giving sacrifice, giving blood as an offering to the elves of the land. The elves essentially being the land wights, the spirits of the land, the genus loci. And even within the Catholic Church, when they asperse the holy water, essentially that is where that comes from classical pagan practices of blood sacrifice. So what's interesting here, JD mentioned in that, it kind of also draws comparison to me to the idea and the practices of the Norse Alfblot, to the idea of giving that sacrifice and asperting the blood in order to bless something, in order to make something powerful, and in order to make it hallowed, in order to make it holy, in order to make it sacred. And so by doing this, by aspersing this blood on our doorstep, we are essentially making it sanctified, we are essentially making it hallowed, and we're making sure that no one in the year within that threshold is going to be hurt. Everyone will be safe. And of course, Martinmas, if we look at this connection with blood, we look at Martinmas, the 11th of November, being the Old Samhain, or what's known as the Old Halloween. And Samhain being the blood harvest. You know, we have Lammas, the wheat, the grain harvest. We have Autumn Equinox, the fruit harvest. And also there are ties with Michaelmas there as a folk festival too, in terms of employing the use of corn dolls. A practice that's seen within the modern pagan movement when it comes to Lammas. So that's something that's kind of interesting. Typically in Lammas it is dolls made out of grain rather than corn, but actually I know that there are people within the US that actually employ corn husks, because it's actually more, that's kind of within that area, that's kind of the main produce. And of course it's important to make something relevant to you, relevant within your own personal practice. So I kind of love that, that people do that. And I think that if I had a cornfield next to me, for me, I would use corn husk because it would make sense. But essentially what I'm trying to say is Old Halloween being the blood harvest, being way back when the winter was coming, it was too cold. And essentially, you know, if you had cattle and you had some cattle that were sick and you had some cattle that were dying, you know, essentially that would be something where those cattle would have to be slaughtered, because if they were sick or dying or old, you know, that would mean that you would have meat for the winter, essentially, but it would also mean that you would be using up less resources, and you would be using up less food that you could use on yourself, because of course it's winter, the land is barren, the land is dead, you're not going to be able to grow anything. So all the vegetables or the grains that you have, you would use on yourself and the family rather than any cattle. So typically Samhain would be known as the blood harvest, the blood sacrifice, which in a lot of the times what I used to do with people that would practice within Manchester, we would have blood on our heads as a way to symbolise, and we would actually give physical blood, like pig's blood that you could get, we would give that as an offering, but that would be a way to symbolise the blood harvest, the last harvest for the whole rest of the year, because the cold is coming, winter is coming. Getting all Game of Thronesy on it, I've never even watched it, but essentially, you know, it is the idea of the blood harvest. So yeah, and once again, we see, as mentioned earlier, this idea of St. Martin being a Roman soldier, but converting from Christianity to from paganism to Christianity, sorry. So we see this idea, this saint, which in a sense was pagan and then had converted to Christianity. If we look at the festival of Martinmas, if we look at the festival of St. Martin, you know, it's not normal practice in the official Catholic Church to give an actual physical blood sacrifice to a saint. This is folk Catholicism. This isn't something that is a normal thing that's done, you know. So it's very, very obvious for me, within my mind, that there are older pagan remnants there that blend and carry on under the guise and under the mask of Christianity. And it seems to me that that would be a time in which you would feed an entity, an older entity, or perhaps, as JD says, the spirits of the land. But being able to practice that and keep practicing that under the mask and the guise of St. Martin. So yeah. It was also, there's a couple of other traditions regarding Martinmas. I'm kind of going to leave it there though. I just wanted to talk briefly on it, but either way, before I go, another aspect, as mentioned, is that it is Remembrance Day today within the UK. And what's interesting is that we, as a symbol of remembrance, will wear a poppy. I have mine on my altar. We get paper poppies over here with pins, and every time I buy it every year, and it just falls out every year. I should get a badge really, but I've got a paper one in there. But I put it on my altar or on a shrine of remembrance rather than wearing it because it just falls off. They are terrible, actually, in the greatest of respect. The actual dynamics of it. The ones where they're either sticky back, they're really good, or like kind of pins. Anyway, poppies and the methods in which you wear them aside, the idea of Remembrance Day, again, is to remember those fallen within the world wars, particularly World War II. And the reason why it is the poppy is that after the battle had ended, the fields grew poppies. And of course, if we look at this, we look at the poppy, we look at this, the poppy can also be associated with white, but if it is red, it is soaked in blood, it is soaked in bloodshed. Hence kind of bridging that gap once again to the links and the idea of Old Samhain, the blood harvest, but also the idea of remembrance, of remembering those long gone, of remembering those that have essentially passed on. The idea and the main kind of aspect that we have of Samhain. So yeah. And of course, those of you that don't feel like slitting a goose's throat this evening, I'm certainly not really about that. But if you do fancy doing something for St. Martin, a really traditional thing to do is to draw some of your own blood. Literally draw some of your blood on your finger, and you go to the door and you put it on the door and you say, if there is any blood to be spilt this evening, let it be the blood that is spilt now, rather than anyone else's blood and any other blood for the year ahead. So I actually think I've got that mixed up, but you know what? I'm going to say it again. And I'm not going to go back and edit this. So again, you prick your finger. We've come too far now. We're coming up to 12.5 minutes and I've done about 5 takes for this video. So take 2. But essentially what you do is you prick your finger and you go up to the door and you mark the door of your blood. You can do a little cross or even just a little tup of blood. And you say, if there is any blood to be spilt for the year, let it be the blood that is spilt now. And that's what you do. And that's the way in which you can ensure that there will be magical protection for the coming winter months and darker year ahead, but also for the rest of the year. And that is something that is a very old practice, actually. And of course, you know, I don't necessarily advocate the need to just go out and kill animals. That's not a thing that I'm really about. But of course, it is, if we look at Martinmas, for me to deny that would be silly. For me to deny those past practices and not mention them would be silly and actually missing the point of the festival. Blood is a main feature of Martinmas. A lot of the time we look at Lammas as a season of sacrifice, in which it is. It's all about the aspects of John Barleycorn, about the corn god, you know, essentially the sacrificial god giving himself up for the land. And the same, in a sense, can be said for kind of this festival, but with a much more bloodier aspect to it. But yeah, I hope this video helps. And once again, if you guys can, please check out Cunning as Folks video, all about Martinmas, which is fantastic. But yeah, over and out. I hope you have a lovely day and a very blessed Martinmas, and peace.